Have you ever walked away from someone feeling strangely exhausted, yet unable to explain exactly why? Nothing dramatic happened. They smiled. They said all the right things. They even told you they cared. But something didn't fit. Your mind tried to dismiss it, while your instincts kept whispering that something was wrong. Most people ignore that whisper because we've been taught to judge love by words instead of patterns. We want certainty. We want someone to simply announce their intentions so we never have to question them. Unfortunately, people who fake love understand this better than anyone. They know that words create an image, but behavior reveals the truth. As long as you're focused on the image, you'll miss the reality unfolding right in front of you. Real affection is surprisingly boring. It's consistent. It doesn't require constant decoding. It doesn't leave you wondering where you stand every other day. Fake love, on the other hand, is theatrical. It depends on emotional confusion, because confusion keeps people engaged. The moment you're trying to solve someone instead of simply experiencing the relationship, you've shifted into a game where they're writing most of the rules. This isn't about assuming everyone has bad intentions. Human behavior is more complicated than that. Many people fake love without consciously deciding to deceive anyone. Sometimes they're chasing validation. Sometimes they fear being alone. Sometimes they've confused attention with intimacy for so long they no longer recognize the difference. Regardless of the reason, the patterns remain remarkably similar. The first thing to understand is that people reveal themselves through repeated behaviors, not isolated moments. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can forget to text back. Anyone can become distracted by work or stress. Looking at single events almost always leads to false conclusions. Looking at patterns changes everything. Your brain naturally searches for consistency. When someone's actions don't match their words, your mind experiences cognitive tension. Instead of questioning the person, most people question themselves. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm insecure. Maybe I'm expecting too much. That internal dialogue is exactly what allows fake affection to survive. People who genuinely care make your world clearer over time. People pretending to care make it increasingly confusing. Think about that difference. One reduces uncertainty. The other manufactures it. The first behavior is surprisingly subtle because it often feels exciting at the beginning. They study you with incredible precision. They remember details nobody else notices. Your favorite song. The story about your childhood dog. The coffee order you casually mentioned weeks ago. The book sitting on your desk. The nickname your grandmother used to call you. At first glance, this seems like extraordinary interest. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's information gathering. There's a massive difference between someone paying attention because they value you and someone paying attention because information gives them influence. People naturally trust those who appear to understand them. That's why skilled salespeople ask questions before making recommendations. That's why negotiators spend more time listening than speaking. Understanding another person creates leverage. Someone faking love often accelerates this process. Instead of allowing intimacy to develop naturally, they fast-track emotional closeness by mirroring your personality. Suddenly they love everything you love. Their opinions begin matching yours with suspicious consistency. Your dreams become their dreams. Your values become their values. At first it feels like you've finally found someone who truly gets you. What you're actually experiencing may be behavioral mirroring. Mirroring is a completely normal human behavior in small doses. Friends naturally adopt each other's phrases. Couples unconsciously synchronize posture. People who enjoy one another often begin speaking at similar speeds. Healthy mirroring happens without intention. Manipulative mirroring feels engineered. The easiest way to notice the difference is to pay attention to disagreement. Real people disagree. Healthy relationships include moments where someone says, "I don't really see it that way." Someone faking love often avoids disagreement early because agreement builds dependency. Faster. If every conversation ends with them validating every opinion you have, don't immediately assume you've met your soulmate. Ask yourself something simpler. Have I actually discovered who this person is? Or have I only discovered how accurately they reflect me? Reflection isn't identity. A mirror can show your face perfectly while having no face of its own. Watch what happens when your preferences suddenly change. Maybe you decide to take up running. A week later, they suddenly become passionate about fitness. You start learning photography. Now they've always loved cameras. You mention wanting to move overseas. Coincidentally, they've secretly wanted exactly the same thing. One coincidence means nothing. 10 coincidences deserve attention. Authentic people have stable identities. People performing affection often have adaptive identities. Adaptive identities shift depending on who they're trying to impress. You can observe this outside relationships too. Notice how some individuals become completely different around different social groups. Around one friend, they're intellectual. Around another, they're rebellious. Around another, they're deeply spiritual. Around another, they're highly ambitious. It's not that people have multiple sides. Everyone does. The difference is whether those sides connect into one coherent personality. Fake love often comes from someone who has learned to become whatever earns acceptance. Initially, this feels intoxicating because conflict almost disappears. Eventually, it becomes unsettling because you realize you've never actually met the real person. The second behavior hides inside inconsistency. Not obvious inconsistency. Strategic inconsistency. Imagine someone who gives you enormous attention for 3 days. Constant messages, compliments, plans for the future, long conversations late into the night. Then suddenly, nothing. Hours become days. Replies shrink from paragraphs to single words. No explanation. Then, just as you begin emotionally pulling away, they return with overwhelming affection. Most people interpret this as emotional complexity. It's often reinforcement psychology. Human beings become intensely attached to unpredictable rewards. Casinos understand this. Video games understand this. Social media platforms understand this. The reward doesn't have to disappear forever. It only needs to become uncertain. Uncertainty creates obsession. When affection becomes inconsistent, your attention shifts away from evaluating the relationship and toward recovering the previous emotional high. Notice how your thoughts change. Instead of asking, "Is this relationship healthy?" you start asking, "How do I get them back to how they were?" That question quietly transfers power. You're no longer observing. You're pursuing. This pattern creates emotional dependency because your brain starts associating small moments of affection with relief. Relief feels powerful, sometimes more powerful than happiness. People often mistake relief for love because both create emotional intensity, but they're completely different experiences. Love creates safety. Relief temporarily removes anxiety. One builds stability. The other rewards survival. If you've ever felt incredibly grateful simply because someone finally responded after ignoring you, ask yourself why the absence existed in the first place. Healthy affection doesn't require emotional starvation before feeding you attention. This doesn't mean people must communicate constantly. Everyone has responsibilities. Everyone becomes busy. The difference lies in predictability. Someone who genuinely values you usually provides context. "I've got a crazy week. I'll be traveling. I might be hard to reach." Tiny statements like these eliminate unnecessary uncertainty. People invested in your emotional well-being naturally reduce confusion. People invested in maintaining leverage often increase it. There's another clue hiding beneath all of this. Watch how they react when you stop chasing. This is one of the clearest behavioral tests you can perform without saying a single word. Don't play games. Don't disappear. Simply match their effort. If they text once, respond once. If they call, answer warmly. If they make plans, participate. But stop carrying the relationship alone. Stop initiating everything. Stop solving every silence. Stop creating every opportunity. Then observe. Authentic interest usually adjusts. Performance often collapses. Why? Because the performance depended on your investment to keep functioning. The moment you stop supplying endless emotional energy, the imbalance becomes impossible to hide. Suddenly you're accused of changing, of becoming distant, of not caring anymore. Think carefully about that accusation. Did you actually become distant? Or did you simply stop compensating for their lack of consistency? Many people confuse equal effort with reduced affection because they have become accustomed to unequal dynamics. Balanced relationships can feel unfamiliar if chaos has become normal. One of the strongest emotional traps is believing that love should always feel uncertain. Movies reinforce it. Stories romanticize it. Songs celebrate it. But uncertainty isn't evidence of passion. It's often evidence of instability. When someone truly wants to remain in your life, you rarely have to decode every interaction. Their behavior answers questions before your anxiety creates them. And that's where the next pattern begins to reveal itself. The interesting thing about human behavior is that people rarely reveal their intentions through dramatic moments. Most of the time, the truth leaks out through habits so ordinary that nobody thinks to question them. That's why so many people stay in one-sided relationships for months, sometimes years. They're waiting for a single, undeniable piece of evidence while ignoring hundreds of small, behavioral clues that have been pointing in the same direction all along. The third pattern isn't loud. In fact, it's often disguised as vulnerability. Someone who's faking love frequently becomes an expert at making every difficult conversation revolve around them. At first, it doesn't seem manipulative. You bring up something that hurt you. Maybe they canceled plans for the third time. Maybe they disappeared for 2 days without explanation. Maybe they promised something important and never followed through. You finally decide to express how you feel. Within minutes, the conversation changes direction. Instead of discussing your experience, you're now comforting them. They tell you they've been under incredible pressure. They remind you how hard their childhood was. They explain that everyone always misunderstands them. They say they're terrified of losing you. Suddenly, you're no longer asking why they behaved the way they did. You're reassuring them that everything is okay. Notice what just happened. Your concern disappeared. Their emotions became the center of attention. This pattern repeats so often that you eventually begin censoring yourself before bringing up problems. Not because the problems disappear, because every conversation leaves you feeling guilty for mentioning them. Healthy vulnerability creates understanding. Manufactured vulnerability redirects accountability. There's a difference. Imagine someone accidentally stepping on your foot. A healthy response sounds like this: "I'm sorry. I didn't realize I did that." A manipulative response often sounds like this: "I've had such a stressful day. I can't believe you're upset with me. I'm trying my best." Both statements acknowledge emotion. Only one acknowledges responsibility. That's an important distinction. People who genuinely care don't see accountability as an attack on their identity. They separate what they did from who they are. Someone pretending to love you often experiences even mild accountability as a threat to the image they're trying to maintain. So instead of addressing behavior, they manage perception. They don't solve the issue, they solve your reaction. If they can make you feel guilty enough, confused enough, or sympathetic enough, the original problem quietly disappears. Behavioral experts sometimes refer to this as changing the frame. Instead of answering the question that was asked, someone changes the conversation, so everyone starts discussing something else. Watch political interviews. A reporter asks about one issue. The speaker answers an entirely different question. The audience often doesn't notice because the response sounds emotional and convincing. Relationships work the same way. Your question was about consistency. Now you're discussing their anxiety. Your concern was about honesty. Now you're talking about how difficult trust has been for them. Again, none of these emotions are necessarily fake. People can genuinely struggle, but struggling doesn't automatically erase responsibility. One of the strongest indicators of authentic affection is someone's willingness to stay inside uncomfortable conversations without escaping them. Discomfort is part of intimacy. If two people can only communicate when everything feels positive, they don't have intimacy. They have performance. Performance survives applause. Relationships survive honesty. Pay attention to what happens after conflict. Do they actually change behavior, or do they simply become better at explaining it? Words are incredibly flexible. Behavior is expensive. Anyone can promise improvement. Consistency requires effort. That's why actions always carry more informational value than intentions. Intentions exist inside someone's mind. Behavior exists in reality. Here's a simple exercise. Think about the last 5 promises someone made to you. Now ignore every explanation they gave. Ignore every apology. Ignore every excuse. Ignore every emotional conversation. Only ask one question. What actually happened afterward? That answer usually tells you more than months of conversations ever could. Another pattern appears when admiration only flows in one direction. In healthy relationships, curiosity never completely disappears. People continue asking questions. They continue learning. They continue noticing changes. They continue celebrating growth. Someone who's performing love often loses curiosity surprisingly fast. Why? Because once they've built the emotional connection they wanted, learning about you becomes less valuable than maintaining influence over you. Listen carefully to your conversations. Who asks more questions? Who remembers follow-up details? Who seems genuinely interested in understanding the other's experiences? If every conversation eventually circles back to their achievements, their problems, their opinions, or their goals, something important is happening. Attention is one of the clearest forms of investment. Where attention goes, emotional energy follows. People naturally invest attention into what they value. This doesn't require constant conversation. It requires genuine interest. Imagine spending an entire evening talking with someone. You leave knowing everything about them. They leave knowing almost nothing new about you. It felt intimate. It wasn't. You became familiar with them. They simply enjoyed being heard. Those experiences can feel incredibly connecting, Because listening creates emotional closeness. The problem is that closeness wasn't mutual. You participated. They performed. The imbalance often becomes visible months later. You realize they don't remember your important meeting. They forget your family event. They overlook things you've mentioned repeatedly. Not because they have a terrible memory, because those details never received meaningful attention. Memory follows importance. The brain naturally stores information connected to emotional significance. That's why people remember embarrassing moments from years ago. That's why they remember birthdays of people they deeply care about. That's why they remember conversations that mattered. When someone consistently forgets things central to your life while expecting you to remember every detail of theirs, the relationship may already be revealing its priorities. Real love expands its awareness over time. Performance narrows its focus. There's another behavior that, even easier to miss because society often mistakes it for confidence. People pretending to love you frequently become strangely uncomfortable when your independence grows. Think about that carefully. If someone genuinely wants the best for you, your success should strengthen the relationship, not threaten it. Yet watch what happens when you become happier without depending entirely on them. Maybe you reconnect with old friends. Maybe you develop new hobbies. Maybe your career improves. Maybe your confidence grows. Maybe you stop needing constant reassurance. Suddenly their behavior shifts. They seem less supportive. They become sarcastic. They criticize small decisions. They question your new interests. Sometimes they don't openly oppose your growth. They simply withdraw enthusiasm. You announce exciting news. Their response feels strangely flat. No excitement. No celebration. No curiosity. Just enough acknowledgement to appear supportive. Behaviorally, this matters because authentic affection celebrates expansion. Possessive attachment fears replacement. Someone who values you wants your world to become bigger. Someone who values control often wants your world to stay small enough that they remain its tree center. That's why isolation rarely begins with direct commands. It begins with subtle influence. They don't really understand you. I just don't trust your friends. I think your family judges us. You've changed since spending time with those people. None of these statements prove manipulation by themselves. Context matters. Patterns matter. Frequency matters. But repeated attempts to reduce outside influence deserve attention. Independent perspectives weaken emotional dependency. Dependency strengthens control. Ask yourself another question. Has your life become larger since meeting this person? Or has it gradually become smaller? Do you have more confidence? More peace? More supportive relationships? More opportunities? Or have you slowly abandoned pieces of yourself to keep the relationship functioning? Identity rarely disappears overnight. It fades through small compromises. One canceled hobby, one missed opportunity, one friendship neglected, one dream postponed. Months later, people look around wondering where the confident version of themselves went. The answer isn't usually hidden inside one catastrophic event. It's hidden inside hundreds of tiny decisions made in the name of preserving a relationship that was never asking them to become more of themselves, only less inconvenient for someone else. And that's where the fourth behavior quietly begins to emerge. Because once someone realizes your identity has started revolving around their approval, they no longer need grand gestures to keep your attention. By the time someone has become emotionally invested, the relationship usually isn't being evaluated logically anymore. It's being protected emotionally. That's why people ignore obvious contradictions. The more time, effort, and hope you've invested, the harder it becomes to admit that something isn't what you believed it was. This is where the fourth pattern quietly takes shape. People who fake love often become remarkably skilled at rewarding your dependence instead of your growth. Notice when they seem happiest. Is it when you're becoming stronger? Or is it when you're relying on them the most? At first, dependence can look like romance. They insist on helping with everything. They want to solve every problem. They constantly remind you that nobody understands you the way they do. It sounds comforting. It feels protective. But over time, something subtle begins to change. Instead of encouraging your confidence, they become the source of it. Instead of supporting your decisions, they become the reason you trust your decisions. Without realizing it, you begin checking with them before making choices you used to make on your own. Not because you need permission, because you've grown accustomed to their approval. There's an enormous behavioral difference between support and substitution. Support strengthens your independence. Substitution slowly replaces it. Healthy love says, I believe in you. Counterfeit love quietly says, you need me. Those two messages can sound almost identical in the beginning. Their outcomes couldn't be more different. Think about the healthiest mentor you've ever had. A great mentor eventually wants you to succeed without them. A controlling mentor wants you to remain dependent on them forever. Relationships operate under the same principle. The goal of genuine affection isn't to become indispensable. It's to become deeply trusted, while encouraging the other person to become even more capable. Watch how someone reacts when you solve problems on your own. Do they celebrate your confidence? Or do they seem oddly disappointed that you didn't need their involvement? These reactions are rarely obvious. Sometimes they're hidden inside jokes. So you don't need me anymore? Sometimes they're disguised as teasing. I guess you've become too good for my advice. Sometimes they appear as subtle criticism. You probably should have asked me first. Individually, none of these comments mean much. Repeated over months, they create a psychological environment where independence begins to feel like disloyalty. That's a dangerous shift. Because now you're not making choices based on what's best for your life. You're making choices based on preserving someone else's emotional comfort. Real love doesn't punish confidence. It respects it. There's another behavior that's easy to overlook because it often arrives wrapped in compliments. People pretending to love you sometimes idealize you far more than they actually know you. In the beginning, they speak in absolutes. You're perfect. I've never met anyone like you. We're exactly the same. You're everything I've ever wanted. Those statements feel incredible because they satisfy a deep human need to feel understood and valued. But there's a question worth asking. How could someone honestly know those things so early? Real admiration grows through experience. Idealization skips experience and jumps straight to certainty. The problem with being placed on a pedestal is that nobody can live there forever. Eventually, reality arrives. You disagree. You make a mistake. You disappoint an expectation they never communicated. Suddenly, the admiration begins to disappear. Not because you've changed dramatically, because the fantasy they created has collided with reality. Healthy love makes room for imperfection. Fake love often depends on fantasy. Fantasy is fragile. Reality isn't. When someone loves the idea of you more than the actual person standing in front of them, every ordinary human flaw begins to feel like betrayal. That's why some relationships change so quickly. 1 month you're extraordinary. The next month you're impossible. What changed? Often nothing except the illusion. Behaviorally speaking, people reveal what they value by what they tolerate. Someone who genuinely cares expects imperfection because they recognize it in themselves. Someone performing affection often struggles whenever reality interrupts the image they've contemned. Another revealing moment appears when success enters the picture. Pay close attention to how someone behaves when good things happen to you that have nothing to truth. With them, your promotion, your achievement, your new opportunity, your personal breakthrough. Authentic love expands during those moments. It becomes curious, supportive, excited. Someone faking love may congratulate you with words while communicating something entirely different through behavior. The conversation changes quickly. Your accomplishment gets minimized. They immediately talk about themselves. They point out potential problems. They joke in ways that quietly reduce your excitement. The emotional energy feels off. It's difficult to explain. Nothing openly negative was said, yet somehow you leave feeling smaller than when the conversation started. Human beings communicate far more through emotional congruence than through vocabulary. Words matter. Tone matters. Timing matters. Attention matters. Enthusiasm matters. People instinctively recognize when those elements don't match. That's why you've probably experienced someone saying, "I'm happy for you," while somehow knowing they weren't. Behavior has layers. Language is only one of them. The fifth pattern is perhaps the most important because it doesn't times a layer's patience. It depends on observing one undeniable fact. People who fake love consistently prioritize the benefits of the relationship over the love, responsibility of the relationship. Think about that distinction. Every relationship provides benefits: companionship, validation, attention, security, status, affection, shared experiences. Those things are normal. The question is, what happens when the relationship requires sacrifice instead of reward? What happens when keeping a promise becomes inconvenient? What happens when supporting you requires time they could spend elsewhere? What happens when honesty carries a personal cost? That's where authentic affection separates itself from performance. Performance is enthusiastic when rewards are immediate. Love remains consistent even when effort is required. Observe someone during ordinary moments, not birthdays, not vacations, not anniversaries. Ordinary Tuesdays, stressful weeks, unexpected problems, small disappointments. Real character almost never appears during celebrations. It appears during inconvenience. Anyone can appear loving when circumstances are easy. Behavior becomes meaningful when circumstances stop cooperating. Ask yourself one final question. If every compliment disappeared, if every promise vanished, if all you had left were this person's repeated actions over the past year, what story would those actions tell? Not the story you hoped for, not the story you imagined, not the story explained through endless conversations. The story written by behavior alone, because behavior doesn't need interpretation nearly as often as people think. It needs observation. And once you begin observing patterns instead of isolated moments, something remarkable happens. The confusion begins to fade. The constant second-guessing starts losing its grip. You stop chasing explanations for behavior that has already explained itself through repetition. You realize that consistency isn't boring. It's one of the clearest signs of emotional honesty. You understand that trust isn't built by impressive declarations. It's built through hundreds of ordinary moments where someone's actions quietly match the person they claim to be. And once you see that difference clearly, it's almost impossible to unsee it.